Hello and welcome to the first video on the feeling. Now, because this is the very first video in a series, there's a couple of things to get out of the way. One is how the series is going to work, and that is that I'm going to do one video on every sound in the whole song, working my way from left to right in the order that you hear them. Also, there's a bit of a format change from the Banana Loaf breakdown in that in each video there's going to be a very, very quick run through at the start and then a sort of slow version, so that the people who know what they're doing don't have to sit through 8.5 minutes of me waffling pointlessly. Lastly, you've probably already guessed this, but I am Pistol Star. I've changed my name to something that doesn't make me want to jump off a bridge, because Glitch Hop Community posted the track. Way! So I thought now was probably a good time to rename myself. Now that's all out the way. Let's get into this mother. Open Hammer. Divide the D-tune by 8 and multiply the frequency by 8 to compensate. Pitch it down an octave. Add some harmonizer. Add a filter envelope. Add a bit of blur. Engage the phaser and turn the width down a bit. Set the speed to 0 and add an envelope on the offset. Reset the keyboard tracking and set the offset to something you like the sound of. Set the wave shape to a square. Add a tiny bit of log distortion. Add some compression. Now add a flangus. Turn the order right up. Turn the depth up a bit. Turn the delay up quite a bit. Leave everything else as it is and turn the dry up to the max. Add a little bit of reverb. Add an EQ. And add some massive reverb in between the notes in the playlist. Okay, now it's time for the slow version, and you'll be relieved to know that Fruity Dance is working now, so it's all good. We've got a full complement. So here's the original pattern. You'll notice there's a trumpet alongside it. But I'm not going to talk about that now, I'll just talk about this. So I'm going to open a new hammer and start it again. Now this is one of the first songs in the track, so I made this with basically an empty project. So didn't really know what I was going for, just something sort of melodic that I could play a tune with, but that wasn't too, loud and in your face. So to that end, I turned it down an octave. Now, I had only just started the track at this point, and I wanted to make something that was unusual, something I didn't usually do. I wanted to press buttons I didn't usually press. So because of that, I turned D-tune up a hell load. So if you don't really know what D-tune does, it's a bit like frequency. So as I turn this up and down, it's pretty obvious what happens. Right, the pitch changes. D-tune is exactly the same, but the fundamental, that is the lowest frequency, stays exactly where it is. That's the only difference. And this is like a multiplier to multiply the frequency of everything. And this orange number here is a divider. So basically what it does is it vertically scales the wave. So all I did was divide it by 8. Nothing particularly special about that number though. But because this wave is now obviously very low pitched, I turn the frequency up to 8 to counteract it. So this was basically the basis of the sound. Probably worthy of note is that if you open another hammer and you have a brick wall high pass, it's basically the same thing. Obviously it's not exactly the same, but you're doing the same sort of thing. In fact, it is the same, but just with less fundamentals, as you can see. So perhaps if I turn this one to a square, It's almost identical. But anyway, I'm getting off topic. That's just an interesting little note about how it works. Anyway, so once I bothered with all this detuning malarkey, I just harmonized it, because it sounds kind of empty and boring right now. Something like that. After I'd done that, I had a filter on it to give it some sort of shape. So basically I had a filter envelope, basically. So, edit articulator, because I wanted a sort of pluck. So something like that. Oh, if you didn't already know this, if you hold shift when you're dragging a point, it stays horizontally where it is, which is very useful. Once I'd done that, I turned up blur. And this is basically just because I wanted to do things I didn't normally do. I have no idea what blur does, other than just what you intuitively guess from looking at the spectrum here. So I just turned blur up a bit. But I honestly have no idea what it does. Other than guessing from the name, of course. Once I'd done that, it was time for a phaser. What I usually like to do with a phaser in Hammer is because normally what a phaser would do is it works on the actual finished audio, like the final flattened waveform. So what it does is it duplicates the wave and puts the two waves slightly out of phase, and modifies the phase of the second one slowly over time to get that weird sweeping effect. However, Hammer doesn't do that. What it actually does is just filters part of the wave out, which is the end result of a phaser basically, but so it achieves the same result, but it does it in a completely different way, which means you can modify the speed like this. So what I usually like to do when I'm using the phaser in Hammer is set the speed to 0 and modify the offset by myself, either with an envelope or an automation clip or something like that, just because it's what I like to do. So just find some setting for mix and width that you like the sound of. The most important thing to talk about with the phaser though is that I had a little envelope like that, so it sort of changes a bit. So the sound changes as the filter fades it out. The phaser type I happened to use was deeper. Now, there's no need to mess around trying to find the perfect height to put this at, because you can just move the offset knob to change the start position. So find some place that you like. Something like that. And the very last thing to talk about in the phaser is the keyboard tracking. So if you middle click this keyboard tracking knob, the shape of the phaser will now follow the keys up and down. So if I play this, with keyboard tracking off actually first, you'll notice there's a sort of bump here. There's a part here where it's louder than the rest. And as I play different notes, notice that it stays where my mouse is. Whereas if I middle click keyboard tracking to turn it on, so that it follows what I'm playing with a 1-to-1 ratio at the same speed, you'll notice that the bump moves depending on the note I'm playing, which is what I wanted in this case. Anyway, so once I'd done all the filter and phaser and all that jazz, I turned it to a square. Why this was just for a matter of experimentation. But I think it makes it sound a lot cleaner. Although I suppose the effect is less obvious right now, but I suppose if you took off all the phaser and so on, it'd probably be a lot more obvious. Now, if you didn't already know, all turning it to a square does in Hammer is cuts out every even harmonic. So if I play a saw for a bit, then turn it to a square, you'll notice it's exactly the same, but just with every other harmonic cut out. And that's good, because when you turn up detune like this, all the harmonics get very close together. So if you scale it so that all the harmonics are twice as close together, but then remove every other harmonic, what do you think happens? So this is the default saw now, and this is detuned with a square. You get exactly the same. You get a saw wave. Not particularly important to this sound, but I think very interesting. Ooh, thank goodness I deleted the right one. What else? Well, that was basically all there was, except for the effects section, where there was a little tiny bit of distortion. Sort of like that. And a hell load of compression, of course. Now, I don't think this actually sounds exactly the same as the original, but this is exactly the settings I changed. So I suppose to make it more similar, you should get the shape of this filter right. And definitely the phaser offset. And width. So even though it doesn't sound exactly the same, it is the same sound, just with the settings a little bit different. So that's everything there is in Harmor, pretty much. So the very first effect that there was on this sound is a flangus, wherever it is. If you don't already know, flangus is basically just a stack of flanges, so it just puts it through a load of flanges in order. If you want to know more about how flangus works, hit that F1 key and there is the manual right in front of you. Read this, it's cool. But all I really did was turn the order up a bit, and this is basically the number of flanges it's being run through. I think turn the depth up a bit, which is, well, the flange depth. Speed went up a bit. Delay was about here. And this is the delay between each of the flanges that it's running it through. Spread is, I think, like a sort of slight difference in all of the settings between each of the flanges. Cross, stay where it is. And I turned the dry up to make it more obvious. So you could hear the original sound coming through a little bit. Maybe the wet down. So that's it. That's the flanger, so. Nice. Tiny bit of reverb. Fuck off, Jakey. Haven't talked to him in years. Although, interesting fact about that guy, he turns up in some of the Numberphile videos sometimes. Anyway, tiny bit of reverb. I really can't remember the exact settings, but it's really not that important. Worth noting, I'm using fruity reverb when usually I would use a free VST called Ambience, which is a very nice reverb by Smart Electronics, if you want to Google it. But I've decided to try and use fruity plugins as much as possible, which is why I'm trying to move away from OTT and start using Maximus instead. Finally, a little bit of EQ, which was kind of like this, I suppose. Now, the sound is now done. Basically, this is it. Hooray, congratulations, you made it, the sound is done. But worth noting is this send channel on the end, which I'll probably talk about in more detail when I do a video on mixing and mastering and all that jazz. But you'll notice that there's a send channel on the end called subcut, which does what it says on the tin. So it cuts the sub out. And a very large number of channels are routed to subcut. Anything with a decent amount of bass in it was routed to subcut, including this sound here. So this example that I just made doesn't have the sub cut out. But the original sound in the actual project does. And you'll notice these sound pretty much the same. But any differences between them are just a matter of like different settings. So that's it. The sound is basically complete apart from two things. One is this, in the original, this huge great big reverb which comes in with an automation clip. Now this is just to fill out the silence. So if you listen to it without it, there's sort of a big long silence which is kind of boring here. So I have a reverb to sort of fill in these big gaps. this is a very common technique in dubstep, where you'll have like big growls and so on, and you'll put little bits of reverb between each growl. Panda Eyes does it a lot, and in fact that's what gave me the idea. So I suppose I could put in some Panda Eyes example here.
Fill out the gaps with reverb. So now it's like...
And here is an example of me trying to do that same thing in one of my projects. And finally, I've done it again here. Now it's quite obvious how to do that, but I suppose for the sake of completeness I might as well do it now. So where are we at? I will copy that onto the channel, turn those off. So here's that tune played on the instrument we just made. Whoops. So it is just a matter of taking another reverb on the end. I always turn down the mix level and init song with this position, just as soon as I put the reverb on, just to make sure that it isn't accidentally turned up at any point in the song, to make sure that by default the mix is always at 0. Turn it up to some ludicrous settings like wet really high, massive, huge decay, and then get out some automation clip of some sort on the mix. Make sure it goes down to the bottom again at the end of the automation clip. Something like that. Done. Whoops, it's supposed to go down to the bottom again after it hits the next note. Done. So that is everything there is to know about this sound. You can now quit this video and go watch something else because it's done. This is for people who have downloaded the project and who have the project in front of them and are looking at the original sound and are going, what the fuck, at some of the things in there. Because there is a lot of things in the original sound which are useless and don't do anything, which I need to explain. So first things first is this image here in the image section. Now, I can't remember exactly what it was, but this is some piece of Foley that sounds like this. This is in part B, but part B is turned off. So you can completely ignore this image, it doesn't do anything. Also is this unison, which is on for some reason, which you can also completely ignore because there's no pan and no pitch. So there's basically 4 waves playing at the same time with no difference between them. Except for the phase, but for some reason you can't even hear that at all, so you can turn the reverb off, no sorry, the unison off, and you can't even hear it at all, it doesn't make any difference. And finally is the pluck shape, which I changed, but pluck isn't engaged, so you can't hear it at all, does nothing. And that genuinely is it. So I think the next video is going to be on the harpsichords, so I will see you there for that. Hope you learned something. See you soon.